Welcome to the Psychology of Money podcast. And to all our listeners tuning in, we're really glad you're joining us today. Please make yourselves comfortable, as if you're right here at home with us.
It's great to be diving into this topic.
Absolutely. Today, we're getting into something that honestly touches everyone's financial life. We're talking about the bandwagon effect, how to stop following the crowd off a financial cliff, especially looking at common money mistakes in your 20s, all through the lens of the psychology of money.
It's a really potent force, often quite subtle, this pull of the crowd.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to explore, why we seem hardwired to follow the kind of financial traps this sets up, particularly when you're just starting out, those formative financial years, and really importantly, how we can consciously choose a different path.
Mm-hmm. Our mission today is definitely to educate, inspire, and hopefully empower you to navigate your own financial journey with confidence. Real confidence, free from that constant pressure to just conform.
Right. To build a financial future that's truly yours, not just a copy of everyone else's. Okay, so let's kick things off right at the beginning. We hear these phrases all the time, right? Jumping on the bandwagon, herd mentality. But what do they actually mean, like in our everyday lives, and especially when it comes to our money?
Well, at its core, the bandwagon effect is this tendency people have to take certain actions or even arrive at a conclusion, mostly because lots of other people are doing it.
Okay.
Think of it like a kind of collective pull. There's a sense of comfort, maybe validation in believing something or doing something when you see many others doing the same. Sources like the CFI team and Wikipedia define it pretty clearly. It's about aligning with popular trends.
And finding comfort in those numbers, right? Like Magellan Financial Group mentioned. If everyone's doing it, it feels safer somehow.
Exactly. That intuitive sense of safety in numbers is incredibly powerful. It feels less risky if you're part of the pack.
But what's actually driving that? What are the deeper psychological forces pulling us in that direction? It feels like more than just wanting to be safe.
Oh, it definitely is. It's not just a casual thing. This behavior comes from some really deep-seated psychological drivers. One big factor is conformism.
Conformism.
Yeah, that innate desire we have to align our own beliefs, our behaviors, with those of a group. It's often fueled by this really fundamental need to, fit in with our peers. It's a way to gain access to a certain social group, or maybe just maintain our standing within it. That's something Wikipedia highlights.
Okay, so fitting in is key. What else?
Another driver is simply deriving information from others. If a huge number of people are doing something, we often just assume they must know something we don't.
Ah, right. Like they've done the research so I don't have to.
Kind of, yeah. So following them seems like a logical shortcut. Why reinvent the wheel if everyone else seems to have figured it out?
So it's not just about the info. It's tied up with our social identity, wanting to belong. How does that connect to terms like herd mentality or groupthink?
Yeah.
Are they just different labels for the same thing?
That's a great question. In social psychology, this tendency to align is widely known as herd mentality or sometimes groupthink. They're similar, but maybe with slight nuances.
Okay.
Groupthink often implies a more, let's say, structured situation, maybe like a committee making a decision, where the desire for harmony or consensus can actually override a realistic look at alternatives. People don't want to rock the boat.
Right. Keeping the peace becomes more important than making the best decision.
Exactly. Herd mentality is maybe a bit broader. It refers more to how individuals can end up acting together almost spontaneously, without any central direction, just by watching and copying what others are doing.
Like schools of fish or flocks of birds, but with humans and, say, stocks.
Precisely. Both, though, lead to this convergence of behavior. Interestingly, just to throw it out there, there's also a reverse bandwagon effect.
Oh.
Yeah, sometimes called the snob effect. That's where people deliberately avoid something because everyone else is doing it. They want to be unique, exclusive.
Huh. Okay, so wanting to stand out instead of fitting in.
Right. But for today, we're really focusing on that magnetic pull towards the crowd. That's the one that causes the big financial cliffs we're talking about.
Yeah, let's stick with that pull towards the crowd. You mentioned shortcuts earlier. Our brains are always looking for ways to save energy, right? We can't possibly sit down and analyze every single decision from scratch all day long.
Absolutely not. Our brains are incredibly efficient, wired to conserve mental energy, thinking critically, deeply analyzing every single piece of information, weighing every possible outcome for every decision. It's just not sustainable day to day.
We'd be exhausted by breakfast.
Pretty much. You'd have cognitive overload really fast.
So to handle this constant mental workload, our brains develop these shortcuts. What are they called again? And which one is really powerful when it comes to this social influence stuff.
Right. So these cognitive shortcuts are called heuristics. They let us make quick, efficient judgments without burning too much mental fuel. And one of the most powerful, especially when we're navigating social situations or making decisions when we're uncertain, is the social proof heuristic.
Social proof heuristic. Okay. So basically, our brain is outsourcing the homework.
Yeah.
Can you give us a simple everyday example of how we use this without even thinking?
Sure, absolutely. Think about this. You're in a new city, looking for somewhere to eat dinner. You walk down a street, see two restaurants side by side. One is completely empty, maybe a tumbleweed blowing through. The other is absolutely packed, buzzing with people.
Okay, I know which one I'm going to.
Exactly. You don't stand there for half an hour pulling up Yelp reviews and comparing menus, do you? You just assume the crowded one must be better. You trust the crowd's judgment.
Yeah, unconsciously.
Right. Because intuitively, that heuristic kicks in. If everyone else is doing it, it must be the right choice. And, in that low-stakes scenario, choosing dinner, it often works out okay. It's a reasonable assumption. But the crucial distinction is when we apply that exact same shortcut to high-stakes situations, like finance. In those cases, outsourcing your due diligence, just following the crowd because it looks like the right thing to do, can be absolutely catastrophic. The potential consequences are just far too high to rely on a mental shortcut like that. Hashtag tag 1.3 real-world financial manifestations.
Right, and that's where it gets really interesting, potentially very dangerous. So how does this social proof, this bandwagon effect, actually play out in the financial world? Can you give us a really clear, maybe recent example of this in action, something listeners might recognize?
Oh, definitely. One of the most common ways it shows up is in price bubbles in financial markets.
The bulls.
Yeah.
Oh.
This happens when the price of a popular security, could be a stock, maybe a new type of asset like crypto, just keeps going up and up. This upward trend then attracts more and more investors. They see the price rising, they get excited, maybe if you feel like they're missing out.
FOMO kicks in.
Exactly. FOMO kicks in hard. So they jump in, bidding the price up even further. It creates this powerful feedback loop and often leads to the security becoming hugely overvalued, like way beyond its actual fundamental worth.
I think the GameStop saga a few years back feels like a perfect example of that kind of frenzy.
It absolutely was a prime, really visible, recent example. Magellan Financial Group actually pointed out that many individuals seeing that stock price just rocketing up, essentially without proper research, jumped on the bandwagon and invested.
Just pure momentum chasing.
Pretty much. And it significantly hurt investors who bought in late, driven purely by that fear of missing out and the incredible hype around it. The key takeaway from GameStop, I think, isn't just about market weirdness, it's a stark reminder. Hype is often a warning sign.
Right. When everyone's yelling, buy, maybe you should pause.
Exactly. When the crowd is driven by FOMO, that's when skepticism, not joining in, becomes your most valuable tool. People weren't looking at GameStop's business fundamentals. They were looking at what everyone else was doing.
It's fascinating. It almost sounds like in these situations, the demand for something can actually go up even as the price goes up, which feels totally backward from basic economics.
It does, doesn't it? It flips the standard demand curve right on its head. The American economist Gary Becker actually argued that the bandwagon effect can be powerful enough to make that demand curve slope upwards, meaning demand rises as prices rise, which completely challenges that conventional wisdom that, as something gets more expensive, people want less of it. It just shows the sheer force of collective human behavior, sometimes overriding those traditional economic principles.
And it's not just like amateur investors getting swept up. I've seen posts on forums like Reddit's or day trading where even experienced traders talk about how hard it is. They say things like, it's tough to trust the trend when the market is yelling at me that it has picked a direction. They complain about betting against what seems like an obvious market move and losing, and they even question if they need a trading psychologist. Yeah. Even the pros struggle with this pressure.
That Reddit example perfectly captures that internal battle. Even when you intellectually get the market mechanics, you understand the risks of herd behavior, the psychological pull to just go with the flow, to conform to what the market seems to be doing can be immense.
Yeah.
It really highlights that this isn't just about a lack of knowledge. It's about these deeply ingrained behavioral patterns, these powerful emotional responses that affect pretty much everyone, no matter how much experience they have.
Yeah.
Hashtag Rev.4 broader societal examples of herd behavior.
Okay, so it's clear this isn't just a finance thing. This bandwagon effect, this herd behavior, it seems like it pops up everywhere in society, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, fashion is an obvious one.
Oh, absolutely. Fashion trends are a classic, really easy to see example. Wikipedia mentions how the rising popularity of a certain look or item encourages more people to adopt it. Often you have public figures, celebrities acting as catalysts.
Setting the trend.
Right. People see others wearing something, it starts to look normal, maybe even desirable, and they're influenced to do the same. It could be about fitting in, seeming current, or just because it's suddenly everywhere you look, the collective adoption normalizes it.
Or think about public opinion, even voting. I remember reading that the serious academic study of the bandwagon effect really took off in the 80s, specifically looking at how opinion polls seem to influence voters. If you see your candidate surging in the polls, or if an issue seems to have overwhelming support.
It can definitely sway you. It highlights how powerful that perception of popularity can be. It doesn't just shape behavior, it can shape actual beliefs. That feeling of, oh, well, everyone else thinks this, so maybe it's right, is a very compelling psychological force.
Yeah, it makes you doubt your own judgment sometimes.
It does. And the research on this effect has really picked up steam recently, looking at its influence in all sorts of areas. Justin Paul did a review looking at its impact in luxury buying, healthcare choices, clothing, tourism, online shopping, even basic consumer goods.
So it's everywhere.
It's truly pervasive. It shows up wherever you have groups of people making choices. It really underscores how deep-rooted this tendency is in our psychology.
So, yeah, it's definitely not just some cute phrase. It's a well-researched phenomenon shaping so many parts of our lives, including, crucially, our financial decisions. And it shows how easily our financial independence can be quietly chipped away by these pressures if we're not aware.
Okay, that brings us perfectly to the why. Why is it so incredibly difficult to resist this pull? It's clearly not just a logical calculation. There's a really strong emotional current running underneath it all, isn't there? I mean, I've definitely felt that urge to just go along.
Oh, there absolutely is. At the very heart of this cascade of following the crowd, you find two incredibly potent emotions. First is the fear of missing out, FOMO.
Right, FOMO. We know that one well.
We do. And then there's its maybe even darker twin, the pain of being wrong alone.
Ooh, the pain of being wrong alone. That sounds intense. It is. As the source, the psychology of money, resisting the bandwagon effect, points out, FOMO kind of draws you in, right? It creates that sense of urgency, like, everyone else is getting rich, I need to get in on this. But the potential pain of standing apart, of being the only one who made the wrong call while everyone else succeeded, that can be even more compelling. It can feel psychologically crushing.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought. It really does take guts to be a contrarian, doesn't it? To deliberately go against the grain. I remember almost talking myself out of buying a perfectly good, sensible used car once because all my friends were leasing brand new ones.
Mm-hmm.
The thought of being the odd one out, the one with the older car, even though it was a smart financial move,
Yeah.
it was surprisingly powerful. I almost caved.
That's a perfect, really relatable example of how deep this feeling goes. Dr. James Montier, who's a well-known behavioral finance expert, he notes that going against the crowd, being that contrarian investor, it can be psychologically painful and sometimes even feel physically uncomfortable. Believe it or not, yeah. Our brains are essentially hardwired to seek conformity. It's an old survival mechanism. When we deviate from the group, a part of our brain called the insula, which is responsible for detecting errors and also processing pain, it literally lights up on scans.
Wow, so it's not just feeling awkward. Our brain interprets it as an actual error or even pain, like a threat.
Precisely. It feels like a genuine threat. And that goes way back to our ancient past. Being alone, being kicked out of the tribe, that often meant death. Survival depended on sticking together, on being part of the group for safety, for resources.
So that ancient fear of being isolated still whispers in our ear when we're deciding whether to buy Bitcoin or sell a stock.
That's a great way to put it. That primal fear still echoes in our modern financial decisions, making it incredibly difficult to stand apart even when all the data, all the logic, suggests it's the right thing to do. Hashtag 2.2 overconfidence and the representativeness heuristic.
Okay, so you've got FOMO pulling you in, and the fear of being wrong alone pushing you to conform. But sometimes this herd mentality gets tangled up with how we see ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially overconfidence. We all tend to think we're a bit better than average, don't we?
Yes. Unfortunately, that's very common. Research consistently shows that most investors, probably most people in general, tend to overestimate their own abilities. Alan Gray, Australia, points this out.
The better than average effect.
Exactly. And this self-assurance, while it might feel good, can actually lead to some pretty dangerous financial decisions. It makes us less critical of our own judgments, maybe less likely to seek outside advice, and ironically, more susceptible to subtle biases, including the ones coming from the crowd. We think, oh, they might get swept up, but I see what's really going on. I can ride this wave and get out at the right time.
Right. I can see how that directly feeds into thinking you can time the market. Intellectually, we might know markets are unpredictable, but deep down, we still think we can spot the turning points, especially when it looks like everyone else is making easy money.
Exactly that. This overconfidence can absolutely lead people to believe that they know when a market move is going to happen, even if logically they understand it's mostly unpredictable. Robert Shiller's survey after the 1987 crash is just striking on this. Nearly half of the investors trading that chaotic day thought they had a pretty good idea when a rebound was to occur.
Wow. In the middle of a historic crash, they thought they knew when it would bounce back.
They felt they had some kind of special insight, almost like a premonition about the market's immediate future, an insight very, very few people actually possess.
That sounds a lot like the representativeness heuristic you mentioned earlier coming into play, that mental shortcut where our brain sees patterns and assumes they'll just keep repeating, even if there's no good reason to think they will.
Precisely. The psychologists Tversky and Kahneman famously demonstrated this cognitive shortcut. People judge uncertain situations by looking for familiar patterns, things that look like something they've seen before, and then they assume future patterns will resemble those past ones. But the crucial error is they often do this without really stopping to consider the underlying reasons why that pattern occurred in the first place, or, importantly, the actual statistical probability of it repeating. It's like pattern recognition on autopilot, without the critical analysis. We make decisions based on superficial similarities, not deep understanding.
So it leads to that subtle thinking like, oh, I've seen this setup before. If I buy this stock now, it's bound to go up. Or maybe, hey, I've made 3 good trades in a row. I've got a hot hand. My luck is in.
That's exactly it. Those subtle, often unconscious thought patterns contribute significantly to the overconfidence that helps fuel speculative bubbles. It's a dangerous cocktail. Our built-in biases, our emotional responses like greed or fear, and that desire for quick, easy gains. We project past wins or recent trends onto the future, assuming things will continue in a straight line when, in reality, there's often just randomness or maybe a temporary collective delusion driving things.
Okay, moving on from overconfidence.
Yeah.
Let's talk about hindsight bias. This is another one of those tricky cognitive biases. It really messes with our ability to learn from the past, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You look back at a decision, maybe one that went wrong, and suddenly it seems so obvious what you should have done differently.
It truly is. It's a really pervasive bias. Magellan Financial Group calls hindsight bias a dangerous state of mind, precisely because it clouds your objectivity when you're assessing past investment decisions. After an event has happened, after you know the outcome, it makes you believe that you knew it all along.
Right. I knew that stock was going to tank.
Yeah.
Even though you held on to it.
Exactly. Or that the outcome was far more predictable than it actually felt at the time you were making the decision. It actually warps our memory of our own thought process, making us feel like we were prescient, like we saw it coming, when in reality we were probably just as uncertain as everyone else.
So if we always feel like we knew it all along, then we never really learn, do we? You can't learn from mistakes if we don't truly acknowledge them as mistakes made under uncertainty. It's like rewriting history in our own minds.
You've hit the nail on the head. It specifically inhibits your ability to learn from past mistakes, as Magellan Financial Group puts it. If you convince yourself, oh, I saw that crash coming, or I knew that tech stock would soar, you never genuinely analyze why you made the decision you did at that specific time with the information you had then.
Yeah.
You don't examine what information you might have missed or what biases, like maybe following the herd, were influencing you.
Wow.
This prevents any real growth or improvement in your decision-making because you deny the uncertainty and the complexity that were present at the moment of decision.
Okay, so how do we fight this? How can we get a more honest, objective look back at our past decisions without that distorting lens of 2020 hindsight?
Well, it takes conscious effort. Magellan Financial Group actually describes their own internal process for combating it. They make it a practice to set out a detailed investment case for each stock, including our estimated return up front before they invest.
Writing it down beforehand.
Exactly. This pre-commitment to a specific rationale and an expected outcome, all documented before the results are known, allows them to go back later and accurately assess their investment history. They can compare their initial thesis, why they thought it was a good investment, to what actually happened.
That sounds really disciplined.
It is. It fosters genuine learning. They can see what they got right, what they missed, why things turned out differently than expected. It's a powerful method, not just for individual stocks, but also for broader macroeconomic calls. It forces honesty. Hashtag 2.4, anchoring and justifying decisions.
That's a really smart, proactive way to tackle hindsight bias. But our brains aren't done with the shortcuts yet, are they? There's another fascinating psychological pull, especially when we're facing uncertainty, and that's anchoring. Robert Shiller talks about how our decisions in ambiguous situations often get latched onto whatever available anchor is at hand. We just grab onto whatever number is before you.
It's true, and it can be surprisingly powerful even when the anchor is completely irrelevant. Tversky and Kahneman, again, demonstrated this brilliantly with their famous Wheel of Fortune experiment.
Right. Tell us about that one.
Okay, so they asked subjects to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. But before the subjects gave their answer, they spun a Wheel of Fortune like a game show wheel that landed on a random number between 0 and 100.
A completely random number.
Totally random, and the subjects knew it was random. Yet their estimates were significantly influenced by whatever number the wheel landed on. For instance, if the wheel stopped at 10, the median estimate people gave was 25%. But if the wheel stopped at 65, the median estimate jumped to 45%.
Wow. Just because of a random number spin beforehand?
Yep. That random number, however arbitrary, became a cognitive anchor. The brain latched onto it and used it as a starting point for the estimate, significantly skewing the final judgment.
That's wild. The brain just desperately needs some starting point, even a meaningless one. And this happens in financial markets too, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. In financial markets, maybe an individual stock's price change gets implicitly anchored to how other stocks in its sector are moving. Or maybe it's PE ratio, the price-to-earnings ratio, a common valuation metric.
Right, price divided by earnings.
Exactly. That PE ratio might get mentally anchored to the PE ratios of similar companies. This kind of implicit comparison provides a convenient, though often totally arbitrary, reference point. Well, company X trades at 20 times earnings, so company Y should too.
Even if their growth prospects or risks are totally different.
Precisely. This helps explain why stocks in the same sector often move together, sometimes regardless of individual company news, and why whole market indexes can be so volatile. These anchors provide a kind of day-to-day stability, but as Shiller says, they can let loose occasionally, sometimes suddenly, leading to those big, dramatic market shifts when the anchor breaks or a new narrative takes hold.
Okay, so we anchored in numbers. But beyond just numbers, there's also this deep need we seem to have to justify our decisions. We want to feel like we have a good, solid, logical reason for why we did something, even if, looking back, the logic wasn't quite sound.
That's a really profound point about human nature. We have this deep-seated need to find, or sometimes even invent, simple reasons to justify our choices. Shiller discusses a fascinating experiment about this. Subjects had to decide which parent should be awarded custody of a child. One parent was described as sort of average on most dimensions. The other parent was described with a mix of strong positive and strong negative traits, the enriched option.
Okay, so one average, one more extreme, both good and bad.
Right. When asked who should get custody, subjects more often chose the enriched parent. But here's the twist. When a different group was asked who should be denied custody, they also chose the enriched parent more often.
Wait, that doesn't make sense logically. How can they be both the best choice to award and deny custody?
Exactly. It's logically inconsistent, but it shows this powerful drive to have a solid reason for the choice. The enriched parent, with their mix of strong traits, simply offered more reasons, both positive and negative, that the subjects could latch onto to justify their decision, whichever way they were asked to decide.
So the need for a clear justification overrode logical consistency.
That's right. And this tendency holds true even for purely personal decisions where we don't actually need to justify ourselves to anyone else. It highlights our internal need to create a coherent narrative for our actions, to feel like our choices make sense, even if we have to bend the logic a bit to get there.
Wow. Okay, so with all these powerful psychological forces swirling around FOMO, overconfidence, hindsight bias, anchoring, the need to justify, it's really easy to see how people, especially those just starting out in their 20s, can stumble right into some common financial traps or cliffs, as we're calling them. Let's dive into those specific mistakes. What's the first major pitfall you see?
I think the first and maybe the most fundamentally damaging one is that inherent human bias towards short-term thinking. We really struggle with delayed gratification.
Yeah, wanting it now.
Exactly. Bolden highlights this. We tend to over-index on immediate benefits, giving them way too much weight in our decisions. But the thing about financial decisions is they aren't just about today. They have ripple effects across your entire future. What feels like a small, maybe insignificant choice right now can have huge cascading consequences down the road.
That really hammers home the impact of those small, everyday spending choices. Like that $100 dinner out, it feels like a nice treat, not a big deal in the moment. Surely it won't break the bank.
And maybe one single instance won't. But Bolden puts it pretty starkly. If you're doing that $100 dinner out every single week, you could be taking a year away from the life you want in retirement.
A whole year, just from weekly dinners.
Yeah, the math adds up terrifyingly fast when you look at the long-term impact and the loss compounding.
Yeah.
These small, seemingly harmless, repeated decisions accumulate into massive long-term differences. And this same bias towards immediate gratification fuels that classic investment mistake: buying high and selling low.
The opposite of what you should do.
Right. Investors get driven by fear when markets fall or greed when markets rise.
Right.
They chase short-term returns, jumping into the latest investment craze or fad or whatever did well last month or last year. The CFA Institute points out that once an investment becomes super popular, once everyone's talking about it, your edge in figuring out its true value basically disappears.
Okay.
You're often buying right at the peak of the hype, just before the inevitable correction. Hashtag tag 3.2, the trap of conspicuous consumption and debt.
Okay, so short-term thinking is killer. And then there's that other powerful lure: showing off. Conspicuous consumption, wanting to keep up with the Joneses or maybe even leapfrog them, often driven by seeing what we think others are doing or have.
It's a very powerful social driver, for sure. Morgan Housel, in his book, The Psychology of Money, makes a really compelling argument about this. He says, buying fancy objects, especially high-cost recurring commitments like car ownership, is just the wrong place to invest your money if what you are after is respect and admiration.
So buying stuff doesn't actually buy respect.
He argues that things like humility, kindness, empathy, which are free, by the way, are far more effective at earning genuine, lasting respect from others. He makes this really sharp point that nobody is as impressed by your possessions as you are. We think our fancy car or watch sends a powerful message, but often others barely notice or care.
That's a tough one to swallow, maybe, but it probably rings true if we're honest. So true wealth, then, isn't about the stuff you can display. It's often hidden.
Exactly. Housel states it very clearly. Spending to show off your wealth is one of the quickest ways to sabotage your financial health. True wealth, he argues, is what you don't see. It's the fancy cars not purchased, the watches not worn, the diamonds not bought.
So it's the absence of spending.
It's the financial assets that haven't yet been converted into the stuff you see. This invisible wealth is what actually buys you freedom, flexibility, options. But building it requires discipline, self-control, and crucially being okay with not looking rich. It's about prioritizing building actual assets over just projecting an image of success.
And we see so many real-world examples of this leading people, especially young people, into trouble. What are some of those common traps that came up in that Reddit forum, our Personal Finance and Z?
Oh, yeah, that Reddit thread was a treasure trove of cautionary tales. A really common one users mentioned was buying lots of non-essential items that depreciate fast on credit. Think big screen TVs, the absolute latest top-of-the-line iPhone every year. Expensive gaming consoles, new cars that lose value the second you drive them off the lot. These are classic examples of prioritizing that perceived status or immediate pleasure over building long-term financial health.
And what about those interest-free deals? They seem tempting.
They do, but they're often traps. Users frequently talked about the danger of those so-called interest-free credit cards like Gem Visa or Q Card were mentioned. They can easily become gateways to significant debt. One person shared a really tough story about struggling with an $8,000 debt that started with one of those cards. They emphasize that even payments that seem manageable week to week can become a real bitch, as they put it. When life throws you a curveball, you lose your job, have a medical expense, and suddenly that debt snowballs into something unmanageable.
Right, the interest kicks in with a vengeance if you miss a payment or don't clear it in time.
Exactly. And then there's just the basic misuse of credit altogether. Using overdrafts or credit cards for, as one user put it, dumb reasons, buying a PlayStation. new sneakers instead of reserving credit for genuine essential expenses like utilities if you're short one month, or emergency car repairs.
Yeah, it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of credit as a tool versus a way to fund a lifestyle you can't afford.
It really does. And financing expensive cars came up again and again. Like, avoid financing that luxury car, say a $30,000 BMW using premium gas, especially if your job isn't totally secure. It can rapidly become this overwhelming burden, sucking up a huge chunk of your income for a depreciating asset with high running costs. It diverts money that could be going towards savings, investments, or just building a safety net. These are mistakes that can seriously hamstring you financially for years, limiting all your future options.
Okay, those are really clear traps related to spending and debt. But it's not just about the money going out. It's also about the opportunities missed, right? The things you don't do to build that future self. What about neglecting your career, your earning potential?
That's a huge one. A really strategic mistake that can negatively impact you for your entire working life. Coasting at work and not investing in your career and long-term earnings potential was a common regret shared on that Reddit thread.
Just getting comfortable, maybe too comfortable.
Exactly. Many people regretted staying in jobs too long, maybe out of inertia or fear of change, when, as one person put it, a 20K pay rise doing exactly the same thing was potentially available just by looking elsewhere. Your ability to earn money is your single most powerful financial asset, especially when you're young. Continuously learning new skills, developing your expertise, making strategic career moves, those are investments that pay enormous dividends over decades.
And speaking of investments paying dividends, let's talk about savings and retirement contributions. The power of compounding is incredible, but so many people, especially younger people, skip making those early pension or retirement contributions. It feels like something for older people to worry about.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it's such a costly mistake. Not paying heavily into a pension very early on is another major misstep, often driven again by that immediate gratification bias, wanting the money now rather than locking it away for decades.
Yeah.
But the math is just undeniable. Even investing just the bare minimum in schemes like KiwiSaver, as mentioned in the NZ context, can compound into literally hundreds of thousands by retirement. The earlier you start, the more time that magical force of compounding has to work. It turns small, consistent contributions into substantial wealth, far more than you could ever achieve by trying to catch up later. It really is the closest thing to financial magic we have access to.
And that ties into just a general lack of savings discipline, doesn't it? Just spending money because it happens to be sitting in your checking account, never building up an emergency fund, maybe not even having a separate savings account at all. It feels like a real lack of basic financial structure.
It is a foundational error, absolutely. The New You Institute points out some of these basic financial planning failures. Things like living paycheck to paycheck, that's a huge red flag for overspending. Impulse purchases, like regularly buying stuff you don't really need, whether it's gadgets or those daily expensive coffees. Maxing out credit cards by relying on them just to cover monthly expenses is another danger sign.
Yeah.
And maybe the most fundamental of all, not tracking your spending. If you don't even know where your money is going, how can you possibly control it? Overspending becomes almost inevitable, and establishing any kind of consistent saving habit is basically impossible without that awareness.
Okay, so those are individual habits, but what about the impact of relationships? I've definitely heard people say that picking the wrong partner, or even just having a partner who isn't on the same page financially, can be fatal to your long-term wealth and even a relationship killer, according to some of those Reddit comments. This seems incredibly important, but maybe less talked about.
It's incredibly insightful and often goes overlooked in purely financial discussions, but it's huge. Chronic money conflicts in a relationship often stem from fundamentally different values around money. Maybe one partner values security above all else, while the other prioritizes freedom and experiences, or maybe status.
And those clashes can be deep.
They can. Poor communication about financial expectations and goals is obviously a big factor. Past experiences, maybe one partner grew up with debt or poverty, shaping their views can play a role. And sometimes underlying power dynamics in the relationship get played out through money. Financial alignment, open and honest communication, and having shared goals, these are truly cornerstones of long-term partnership success and overall financial well-being. A partner who consistently undermines your financial goals, even if they don't mean to, can honestly be more damaging to your wealth than a major market crash.
Wow, that's a strong statement, but I can see how it could be true over time. And then there's something probably even further from the minds of most 20-somethings. Estate planning, getting a will. Thinking about beneficiaries, why do people, even older people sometimes, avoid this despite how important it clearly is for their families?
Yeah, it's often put off indefinitely. There are several deep psychological barriers at play. One is the invincibility bias, especially common among younger people. We tend to believe we'll live longer than average, so subconsciously we push aside thoughts of death and the need to plan for it.
Denial.
Absolutely. Denial of mortality is a powerful force. It's just emotionally difficult for most people to confront their own finite existence. Then there's the fear of family conflict, worrying that discussing assets or inheritance will stir up tensions among family members after you're gone. Sometimes there's a lack of trust in potential beneficiaries or the people you might name as trustees, worrying they won't manage the wealth responsibly.
And it just seems complicated, right?
Yeah, exactly. Finally, the perceived legal complexities can just feel overwhelming. All the paperwork, the lawyers, the decisions. It can feel like too much hassle, leading to procrastination and ultimately inaction, which sadly often leaves families in really difficult, stressful situations down the line.
It seems like all these mistakes we've discussed, from the short-term spending traps to neglecting long-term planning like careers or wills, they often boil down to maybe a deeper issue. This tendency some people have to sacrifice their overall well-being in the relentless pursuit of more money, chasing more even when, as the New You Institute put it, by all objective evidence they have enough. What drives that? Why can't people feel satisfied?
That's the ultimate, often tragic paradox many successful people face. The New You Institute points to several potential drivers behind this. Sometimes there's just a very strong acquisitive drive, an almost insatiable desire to accumulate more, often fueled by a deep-seated fear of scarcity, maybe a need for status, or sometimes a subconscious attempt to fill some kind of emotional void.
Like money can buy happiness, even though we know it can't.
Right. Then you have workaholic tendencies, where people derive almost all their self-worth from their work achievements and the material success that comes with it, often neglecting their health, relationships, and other crucial aspects of a fulfilling life. Many people also find themselves stuck on a hedonic treadmill.
The hedonic treadmill.
Yeah, it's the idea that we chase fleeting happiness through buying more stuff or achieving the next goal. But the satisfaction is always temporary. It quickly plateaus, and then we need the next bigger house, faster car, higher promotion to get that same feeling again. We're constantly chasing a high that never lasts, never finding true contentment. And sometimes, honestly, it can stem from unhealed trauma related to past experiences of scarcity or financial insecurity. That fear can manifest as an unhealthy fixation on accumulating money, far beyond any reasonable need for security. These aren't just financial errors, they're often deep psychological patterns that prevent people from enjoying the wealth they have and living a balanced, truly rich life.
Okay, it's incredibly clear how much our own internal psychology, our biases, emotions, habits, plays a massive role in these financial missteps and makes us susceptible to that bandwagon pull. But it's definitely not just internal, is it? There are powerful external forces out there that seem to amplify the effect, making it even harder to resist. Let's start with one of the biggest, the media. How does the media shape our perceptions and, maybe more importantly, our attention, especially when it comes to financial markets?
Oh, the media's role is absolutely significant, and it works in several ways. First, you have to remember that news organizations are businesses. They're constantly competing with each other to capture public attention. That's their lifeblood, essential for survival and revenue.
Eyeballs in clay.
Exactly. And Robert Schiller points out they achieve this by finding interesting news, focusing on stories that have word-of-mouth potential, things people will talk about, and by defining an ongoing story that encourages their audience to remain steady customers. This competitive pressure means they're always looking for narratives that will engage, excite, or maybe even alarm people, and that naturally influences how financial information gets presented and consumed.
So that constant hunt for an engaging story means they aren't just passively reporting market facts, they're actively shaping how we perceive the market.
Absolutely. The media isn't just a neutral messenger, it actively shapes public attention and categories of thought, as Schiller puts it. They essentially create the environment, the context in which market events happen and how they unfold. They can ramp up interest by linking stories to price movements people are already seeing, or by reminding the public of similar past episodes, is this like 1999 all over again? Or by speculating about what big institutional investors might be doing.
Creating a narrative.
Precisely. It creates this powerful feedback loop where media reports about market movements can then cause further movements, either accelerating a speculative bubble or deepening a panic.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed how the media seems to thrive on superlatives, like Schiller says, always stressing new records, record highs, record lows, record trading volume. But he points out this can be pretty misleading, right? Making things sound way more dramatic than they might actually be.
It absolutely can be misleading, and it's a common tactic. Media outlets frequently report record one-day price changes in terms of points on an index like the Dow Jones rather than in percentage terms.
Right. A 500-point drop sounds huge.
It does, but its actual significance is totally different if the Dow is at 35,000 versus, say, 5,000. Reporting in points makes hitting new records, both going up and going down, much more statistically likely as the index level grows over time. And it sounds more impactful, more dramatic, which fuels excitement or panic, often out of proportion to the actual percentage change. It amplifies our emotional responses.
And the media doesn't just report the news. They can influence how we interpret it, essentially shaping the story of why things are happening. Schiller talks about that analyst Granville back in the day. News stories about his market predictions, which apparently had huge word-of-mouth potential, actually had a cumulative effect on national attention and seemed to change how people reacted to market dips. It's like the interpretation became the news itself.
Indeed. And what's really fascinating is looking back at how the media framed major historical market events. For instance, newspapers covering the 1929 crash consistently interpreted it in terms of investor psychology and technical rather than fundamental considerations. They weren't focusing primarily on underlying economic news.
So they blame the investor's mood.
Largely, yes. The most prominent news coverage was often filled with interpretations of the reasons for these previous moves. They created this narrative around the market's internal dynamic speculation, margin calls, human emotion, rather than focusing on external, verifiable economic fundamentals. And that narrative then becomes self-fulfilling, reinforcing the idea that markets are driven mainly by collective sentiment, which encourages more people to react to sentiment.
That's a critical point, the interpretation driving further events. And Schiller's survey right after the 1987 crash really seems to hammer this home, doesn't it? When he asked investors why they thought that massive one-day plunge happened, what did they actually point to?
It does, profoundly. His survey, conducted immediately after that chaotic Black Monday, October 19th, 1987, revealed something striking. The most highly rated news stories that investors themselves pointed to as influencing their decisions were stories about past price declines themselves.
Not economic news.
No. Things like the 200-point drop earlier that morning or the record declines over the preceding week. It wasn't exogenous economic news or changes in company fundamentals. When asked for key themes driving the crash, investors cited things like the market being overpriced, about a third of both individuals and institutions, worries about institutional stop-loss orders triggering more selling, a technical factor, and simply investor irrationality panic, about a quarter of both groups.
So the market's own behavior became the main news, feeding the panic.
It clearly suggests that, yes, the market's own downward momentum became the dominant narrative, feeding the feedback loop where falling prices directly caused more fear and more selling, rather than external economic factors being the primary driver of the decline that day. Hashtag 4.2 technological and institutional shifts.
Okay, so the media plays a huge role in shaping attention and narratives. But beyond that, there have been massive shifts in technology and financial institutions that have also likely amplified this bandwagon effect over the years. The incredible growth of mutual funds, for instance, that must have fundamentally changed how ordinary people interact with the stock market.
Oh, absolutely. The huge stock market booms we've seen in recent decades went hand in hand with an equally significant growth spurt in the mutual fund industry. The numbers are staggering. In 1982, there were about 340 equity mutual funds in the U.S. By 1998, that number had exploded to over 3,500.
More funds than stocks listed on the New York Stock Exchange.
Exactly. And shareholder accounts in those funds ballooned from around 6 million to almost 120 million over that same period. This massive proliferation naturally drew immense public attention towards stocks. It created a much, much larger pool of individuals who could potentially be influenced by the bandwagon effect, often channeling their savings somewhat passively into these large collective investment vehicles.
And then you have the rise of things like 401k plans in the U.S. or similar defined contribution plans elsewhere. They completely changed the game for how millions of employees interact with the market, didn't they? Almost forcing them to become investors, ready or not.
They absolutely did. The big shift away from traditional defined benefit pensions towards these defined contribution plans, like the 401k, which first appeared in 1981, essentially pushed the responsibility for investment decisions onto individual workers. People were suddenly forced to learn about the difference between stocks and bonds and make active choices about how to allocate their retirement savings.
Plus, there were strong incentives to join in.
Right. Tax incentives and, crucially, employer matching contributions provided really powerful reasons to participate. This brought a whole new wave of often less experienced, less financially savvy investors directly into the market, many of whom would naturally gravitate towards default options or follow whatever their colleagues seemed to be doing.
And I remember reading about something called the category effect, specifically with 401k, how people tend to just spread their money evenly across whatever options are offered. That has some weird implications.
It does. It's quite fascinating. The economists Shlomo Benartzi and Richard Thaler found this tendency. People often just allocate their contributions evenly across the investment options available in their plan, kind of regardless of what those options actually are.
Like a one allocation.
Exactly, the one heuristic. So for example, if a plan offers just two choices, say a pure stock fund and a balanced fund, which might itself be 50% stocks, 50% bonds, people might just put 50% of their money into each fund.
Okay, so effectively they put 75% of their total contribution into stocks, 50% plus half of 50%.
Precisely. Even though they might not have consciously intended such a heavy stock allocation, this unconscious interest, as Schiller calls it, driven by a desire for simplicity rather than deep financial analysis, can lead to unintentionally high allocations to equities across millions of participants, and thus collectively helps bid up stock prices, especially if many plans offer similar equity-heavy default options.
Wow. Okay, and what about the internet itself? Its arrival was such a game changer in so many ways. It must have had a huge psychological impact on market behavior, too.
Oh, undoubtedly. The internet, with its vivid and immediate personal impression on everyone using it, made it feel very plausible to assume that it also has great economic importance, as Schiller wrote. It fostered this kind of exaggerated sense of the promise of the technology, not just for brand new .com ventures, but potentially for established companies embracing it, too.
The new economy narrative.
Exactly. You saw this incredible growth in internet usage from under 100 million U.S. adults online in 1999 to a predicted 177 million just a few years later. This created incredibly strong psychological support for sky-high market levels, especially for tech stocks, even long before many of these new-era companies actually generated substantial profits. Plus, the sheer ease of access to information, often unfiltered or hyped, and the rise of online trading platforms definitely fueled more speculative activity among individual investors.
It also feels, just anecdotally, like there's been a huge increase in gambling opportunities over the last few decades. State lotteries, casinos popping up everywhere. Does that contribute to a more speculative mindset in general, maybe bleeding over into investing?
I think that's a very plausible connection. There has been a truly dramatic increase in legal gambling opportunities in recent years. You mentioned state lotteries, riverboat or dockside casinos, electronic gaming machines, off-track betting, it's everywhere. Schiller cited figures from 1998 showing 125 million Americans gambled that year, with an estimated 7.5 million classified as problem or pathological gamblers.
That's a lot of people.
It is. And the sheer ubiquity of it now, combined with massive marketing efforts, is really unprecedented in U.S. history, as Schiller noted. It very likely contributes to a more speculative mindset permeating society. It normalizes the idea of taking big risks for a potentially quick payout, and that might blur the lines for some people between responsible long-term investing based on fundamentals and just pure speculation or gambling in the financial markets, making them more prone to chasing hot tips or market hype. Hashtag 4.3 speculative bubbles as naturally occurring Ponzi processes.
Putting all these forces together, the psychology, the media hype, the tech shifts, the gambling culture, it sometimes sounds like a recipe for market instability, almost like a system designed to create bubbles. In fact, some experts, like Robert Schiller again, even refer to speculative bubbles as naturally occurring Ponzi processes. That's a pretty provocative comparison. How does that analogy work? Is he saying bubbles are frauds?
It's a powerful analogy, and no, he's not necessarily saying they are orchestrated frauds like a Bernie Madoff scheme. But he's highlighting how financial markets exhibit these amplification mechanisms, these feedback loops, that behave like a Ponzi scheme in some ways.
Okay, how so?
Well, in classic Ponzi scheme, the fraudster pays returns to early investors using the money coming in from later investors, creating an illusion of success that draws in even more money. In speculative markets, Shiller argues, something similar happens implicitly, naturally. Investors see prices going up. Their confidence and expectations are buoyed by past price increases. This encourages them to bid prices up even further. This, in turn, entices more investors who see the rising prices and jump in, fearing they'll miss out. It creates this self-reinforcing cycle.
So even without a con artist pulling the strings, the rising prices themselves draw in new money, which validates the earlier investors and pushes prices higher still.
Precisely. Even without a fraudulent manager, these speculative feedback loops just arise. And tales about the market are everywhere, Shiller notes. These stories are often spread, perhaps unintentionally sometimes, by industries like stock brokerage or mutual funds, which naturally benefit from telling stories that suggest that the market will go up further. These narratives need only emphasize the positive news and give less emphasis to the negative to keep feeding that cycle of optimism and rising prices.
So the market itself, driven by stories and rising prices, effectively becomes its own Ponzi scheme, attracting new money based on past performance rather than future fundamentals, until eventually it collapses when the new money dries up or sentiment shifts.
That's the core of the analogy, and history is just littered with examples of this dynamic playing out across the globe. The spectacular rise and then dramatic fall of the Japanese stock market after 1989 is a classic case.
Right, the lost decade.
Exactly. Or think about the Asian financial crisis in 1997-98. That was preceded by years of absolutely enormous real stock price increases in the mid-'80s in countries like Japan, up 275%, Hong Kong, up 230%, Korea, up over 500%, Taiwan, up over 460%, Thailand, up over 430%. These were classic speculative buildups where prices soared based on collective enthusiasm and narrative, far detached from fundamentals, before the inevitable, often brutal crash.
And wasn't there a famous case in India in the early 90s, the big bull, Harshad Mehta? That sounded like pure manipulation creating this kind of effect.
Yes, Harshad Mehta, a Mumbai stockbroker back then, really did create a kind of vortex effect, as Shiller called it, partly through market manipulation. It blew up into a huge national scandal and led to a massive market fall over 50% in the year after what became known as the Mehta peak in 1992.
Oh.
These are all just stark reminders of how incredibly powerful these feedback loops can be, driven by human psychology, narrative, and the structure of markets themselves, even if there isn't outright fraud involved in every case. And it comes back to those anchors we talked about. While quantitative anchors, like current price levels or PE ratios, provide some day-to-day market stability, Shiller warns they can let loose occasionally, sometimes suddenly, leading to those dramatic shifts and market surprises that catch everyone off guard. Because news events, or just shifts in collective psychology, can affect people's reasoning and break those anchors in really unpredictable ways. The key lesson is probably that no market, no matter how sophisticated, is totally immune to these dynamics of boom and bust driven by human behavior.
Okay, wow. So it's abundantly clear that the forces pulling us towards the herd, both inside our own heads and from the outside world, are incredibly powerful. But the good news is we're not completely helpless against them. The whole goal here is to learn how to build your own financial compass, right? One that guides you independently, regardless of what the crowd is doing. So where do we even begin to build that? What's step one?
I think the absolute most crucial first step, the foundation for everything else, is to develop a holistic financial plan and get really clear on your long-term goals.
Knowing where you're going.
Exactly. Bolden emphasizes this so strongly. You are more likely to get where you want to go if you know where there is and have a plan for getting there. When you stay focused on those big long-term objectives, maybe it's retiring comfortably at 60, buying a house in 5 years, achieving financial independence by 45, whatever it is for you, that's what helps you make better day-to-day financial decisions. You're less likely to get distracted or panicked by short-term market noise or whatever the latest hot trend is. Without a clear destination in mind, any road looks tempting, and you end up just wandering.
And it isn't just like feel-good advice, right?
Yeah.
There's actual evidence that having a plan makes a difference.
Oh, absolutely. The research is pretty consistent on this. People who actually have and maintain a financial plan tend to make better financial decisions across the board. They save more consistently, they invest more appropriately for their goals, they manage their debt better, they rebalance their portfolios when needed, they budget more effectively.
It provides structure and discipline.
It really does. It acts like a roadmap, helping you stay on track. It becomes your personal anchor against the unpredictable tides of the market and the changing moods of the crowd. Hall Financial Advisors reinforces this, they say. A core tip for avoiding that herd mentality is simply to develop a well-thought-out investment strategy and stick to it regardless of market fluctuations. That consistent, disciplined approach, grounded in your own goals, is key to maintaining focus. Hashtag 5.2, diversify and increase your time horizon.
Okay, so having a plan and sticking to it sounds like a really solid anchor against the pull of the crowd.
Yeah.
But investing always involves risk, right?
Yeah.
How do we manage that inherent risk within the plan? And what role does time play in making it all work?
That's where the classic advice of diversification becomes so important. It's not just a buzzword, it's a fundamental risk management technique.
Spreading your bets.
Essentially, yes. Diversification helps you reduce risk and minimize the impact of market volatility, as Hall Financial Advisors puts it. You do this by spreading your investments across different asset classes, things like stocks, maybe domestic and international, bonds, real estate, maybe some commodities or alternatives.
Why does that help?
Because different asset classes often react differently to the same economic events. If stocks are crashing, bonds might be holding steady or even going up. By holding a mix, you avoid being overly exposed to the poor performance of any single investment or market segment. It effectively hedges your bets against being caught entirely in one specific bandwagon's sudden downturn. It smooths out the ride.
Makes sense. And time. You often hear time called the investor's greatest ally, or the secret weapon. Why is having a long time horizon so incredibly powerful?
It truly is. Warren Buffett famously called compound interest the eighth wonder of the world, and time is the engine that drives it. He said, "Time is the most powerful force when it comes to investing your money." A long time horizon does two crucial things. First, it allows any inevitable mistakes you make along the way to kind of fade into insignificance in the grand scheme of things. Second, and more importantly, it allows those small, consistent investments you make to compound and grow into substantial wealth.
Yeah, that compounding effect is amazing when you see the charts.
It really is. The 13 Principles of the Psychology of Money highlights this. The longer investors are in the money game investing, growing, and learning, the better their results will be. Taking calculated risks, appropriate for your goals and timeline, when given enough time to play out, generally yields good long-term results. Time smooths out the short-term bumps and lets that powerful force of compounding do its incredible work.
We've all probably heard stories, or maybe even know people, who spent years waiting for the perfect time to invest. They were always convinced the market was about to crash, so they stayed in cash, waiting.
And they usually end up missing out entirely, paralyzed by fear or indecision. That's such a powerful illustration of the cost of not acting. Shiller tells that anecdote about Joe, who apparently waited all the way from 1982, when the Dow Jones Index was only around 1,000, for that perfect time to jump in. He was always waiting for the next dip.
So what happened to Joe?
Well, according to the story, at age 62, Joe still had all his money sitting in bank CDs, earning next to nothing. He had completely missed one of the biggest bull markets in history. The hard truth is, there is no perfect time. The market generally trends upwards over the long term, despite all the scary pullbacks along the way. The key insight really is, time in the market consistently beats timing the market. Inaction, driven by fear of short-term volatility when faced with decades of potential growth, is often the biggest financial mistake of all. Hashtag 5.3, cultivate a personal financial philosophy.
Okay, so a solid plan, diversification to manage risk, and patience harnessing the power of time. Those are crucial building blocks. But it feels like you also need something deeper, more personal, kind of financial philosophy that's uniquely yours. How do we even begin to develop that, especially when there's so much advice out there telling us the single rational way to manage money?
That's such a critical point, because the idea of rationality in finance can be misleading. As Morningstar Australia points out, rationality is another way of saying wealth-maximizing behavior. The models often assume the only goal is to get the absolute highest return possible.
Right, the mathematically optimal path.
Exactly. But a purely rational, numbers-only assessment can completely miss the human element. Your financial decisions should ultimately be based around your individual goals, your values, your life circumstances, not just some abstract goal of accumulating the maximum possible wealth on paper. There simply isn't one universal, rational approach that works or is even appropriate for everyone. Your financial philosophy has to be deeply personal, aligned with your life, your priorities, and crucially, your comfort level with risk and uncertainty.
So it really comes down to defining your own money game, like Household talks about. Understanding what game you were playing rather than getting caught up playing someone else's game where their rules, their goals, their time frame might be completely different from yours.
Precisely. Finances are a personal matter, Howes emphasizes. He strongly encourages investors to make sure their actions are not influenced by people who are in a different game. Think about it. People have incredibly diverse goals. Buying a house versus retiring early versus funding travel. Different desires, vastly different investment horizons, someone in their 20s versus someone nearing retirement. This huge diversity is exactly why even the experts often disagree on the best strategy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So you really need to understand at a deep level your own time horizon, your own risk tolerance, your own definition of financial success to avoid getting swayed by others playing short-term games or chasing risky fads that have absolutely nothing to do with your personal journey. Your game is yours alone to define and play.
And a huge part of that personal philosophy seems to be prioritizing your own peace of mind. That sleep well at night factor we touched on earlier, making sure your finances don't keep you up worrying.
Absolutely essential. Housel argues your peace of mind should prevail over the aspiration to achieve returns on your money or the obligation to save a specific percentage just because some rule says you should. What allows you to sleep well at night is paramount.
So it's okay if it's not the optimal strategy on paper.
Totally okay. Some people can sleep perfectly well investing aggressively, taking on higher risk for potentially higher returns that suits their personality and maybe their situation. Others might prefer to save, say, 40% of their income, even if it feels restrictive to others, because that feeling of security is what lets them sleep soundly. Both approaches, Housel says, are totally valid if they align with your personal comfort zone, your risk tolerance, and your specific life goals. The ultimate goal shouldn't be just to be the richest person in the graveyard. It should be to live a life with a comfortable level of financial security and minimal money-related stress along the way.
And that ties back nicely to having humility and compassion, doesn't it? Recognizing that your successes aren't entirely down to your genius and your mistakes aren't entirely your fault either. Luck plays a huge role.
It really does. Housel advises finding humility in success and compassion in mistakes. He reminds us constantly that things are never as good or as bad as they seem. We need to acknowledge the powerful, often completely uncontrollable forces of luck and risk that significantly shape financial outcomes, both good and bad. Instead of beating ourselves up over things we couldn't control or getting too arrogant about wins that might have involved good fortune, we should focus our energy laser-like on the things we can control in our financial lives.
Aye.
Like our savings rate, our spending habits, sticking to our long-term plan, diversifying properly, and crucially, managing our own emotional responses to the market's inevitable ups and downs. That's where our real power lies. Hashtag Shag Tag 5.4, stay informed and seek objective guidance.
Okay, so cultivate that personal philosophy. Focus on what you control. But finally, to truly resist the herd effectively over the long haul, you also need to stay informed and, maybe more importantly, know when it's wise to ask for objective help. It sounds simple, but admitting you need guidance can be hard for some people.
It's absolutely crucial, though. Making informed decisions based on doing your own thorough research and analysis is paramount. Hall Financial Advisors puts it bluntly. Don't rely solely on what others are doing or saying.
Do your homework.
Exactly. That means actually taking the time to understand the fundamentals of what you're investing in, staying reasonably current on broader economic trends, and learning to critically evaluate the sources of information you consume, especially online. Rather than just blindly following a popular tip you heard or some influencer's recommendation on social media, remember, blindly following any advice, even if it comes from well-meaning friends or family, is still a form of herd behavior if you haven't done your own due diligence and decided it truly fits your plan.
Right. But sometimes, even after doing all the research, maybe especially then, you realize you need an objective perspective. Someone who isn't caught up in your own emotional biases, or maybe the general hype surrounding a particular investment or trend at that moment.
That's precisely where consulting a qualified, objective financial advisor can be invaluable. Hall Financial Advisors recommends regularly meeting with your advisor to review your investment strategy, check if it still aligns with your goals, which might change over time, and make any necessary adjustments. They can provide that objective guidance to help you stay on track, especially if you recognize some of those common investment mistakes or behavioral biases we've talked about in your own patterns.
They can be a rational sounding board.
Exactly. The CFA Institute also strongly recommends seeking professional help if you're struggling. A good advisor can help you navigate the complexities of finance without getting derailed by emotional reactions. They can act as that rational counterbalance when market excitement or fear is running high. They can be the coach who helps you stick to your well-thought-out game plan precisely when the urge to abandon it and join the panicked or euphoric herd feels strongest.
Okay, fantastic. We've talked a lot about understanding the bandwagon effect, why it's so powerful, the cliffs it can lead to, and concrete strategies for resisting the herd and building your own financial compass. Now, maybe let's zoom out a bit for the final stretch and consider the true psychology of money. What does it really mean to cultivate a healthy, independent relationship with our finances, one that goes beyond just reacting to external influences or societal pressures?
Yeah, this is getting to the heart of it, I think. And it involves making some really crucial distinctions that often get missed in the simple pursuit of getting rich. Morgan Housel, in The Psychology of Money, makes this incredibly powerful case that true wealth is what you don't see.
The invisible assets.
Exactly. He argues forcefully that spending money primarily to show off how wealthy you are is actually one of the quickest and surest ways to sabotage your long-term financial health. Instead, he says, true wealth resides in the financial assets that haven't yet been converted into the stuff you see. Building it requires self-control, discipline, and, this is key, being genuinely okay with not looking rich to others. It's about cultivating a quiet, internal sense of security and freedom, not projecting a flashy external image.
So it flips the script. It's not about being rich in the sense of having expensive things. It's about being wealthy in the sense of having unspent assets. And it sounds like, based on this, how you save might be even more critical than how much you earn, which kind of goes against the grain of always chasing higher income.
It does, and it's a core message in Housel's work. He states very clearly, your savings rate plays a more critical role in wealth building than your income or stock market returns. And he has this fantastic definition of savings. Savings is simply the difference between your ego and your income.
Wow. Savings is the gap between ego and income. That's powerful.
Isn't it? It means that if you can successfully keep your ego in check, resist the urge to constantly upgrade your lifestyle to match or exceed your peers, and keep your spending consistently below your means, then your savings rate can be incredibly high, almost regardless of your absolute income level. Embracing a more frugal lifestyle, finding contentment with enough, rather than always needing more, whether that means smaller housing, less expensive cars, fewer material upgrades. These are the keys to building financial independence. And crucially, these are factors entirely within your control, unlike market returns, and they have a 100% chance of working if you stick with them.
And ultimately, what does this true, often invisible wealth actually buy you? What's the real payoff, the real dividend of cultivating that discipline?
According to Housel, what it buys you is the ultimate prize: control over your time and options. He argues this is rapidly becoming one of the most valuable currencies in today's world, maybe even more valuable than raw intelligence, which technology is making easier to replicate. True financial freedom isn't about having a Lambo. It's the ability to wake up and dictate your own schedule, to pursue work you find meaningful, to spend ample time with people you love, to make choices based on your values, not just financial necessity. It's the freedom to say no to opportunities that don't align with your life and a resounding yes to those that truly fulfill you. That's the real wealth. Hashtag 6.2. Being reasonable works better than being rational.
That idea of control over time is so appealing. It leads nicely into another powerful, maybe counterintuitive idea from the psychology of money, that being reasonable often works better in practice than being strictly rational. What exactly does that distinction mean for us as individual investors? Why is reasonable better than rational?
It means that instead of obsessing over finding the absolute, mathematically optimal, perfect investment strategy, which, let's be honest, is often incredibly complex, constantly changing, and probably stress-inducing to try and implement perfectly, you should aim for an approach that is pretty reasonable for your situation and, crucially, helps you sleep well at night. The Psychology of Money summary really emphasizes this.
So practicality over perfection.
Exactly. Your personal comfort, your psychological well-being, your ability to stick with the plan without panicking. These are valid and absolutely crucial metrics of a successful financial strategy. They're often far more valuable in the long run than chasing every last tenth of a percentage point of potential return. The theoretically rational choice on paper might be completely unsustainable for you psychologically. If a strategy causes you constant anxiety, you're likely to abandon it at the worst possible time, negating any theoretical advantage it had.
So this really validates all those diverse approaches we talked about earlier. If someone feels comfortable with a higher risk strategy and sleeps fine, that's reasonable for them. And if someone else needs to save 40% of their income to feel secure, that's also perfectly reasonable for them. There's no single right or rational way mandated for everyone.
Precisely. This principle confirms that investing in a risky way will allow some people to sleep well at night, while some prefer to save 40% of their income. Both cases are totally valid. There's no one-size-fits-all rational financial plan because our personal circumstances, our tolerance for risk, our life goals, our emotional wiring, they all vary so incredibly widely. What makes perfect sense for a tenured finance professor with a secure pension might be completely unreasonable and terrifying for a freelancer managing fluctuating income and supporting a family. Your financial plan has to be reasonable for your life, not just rational in a spreadsheet. #tag 6.3. Expect surprises and adaptability.
Okay, so find a reasonable plan you can stick with. But even with the best laid, most reasonable plan, the world and the markets always have a knack for throwing curveballs at us, right? We have to bake in the expectation of surprises, not just assume smooth sailing ahead.
Oh, absolutely. If there's one constant, it's change and surprise. Financial markets are unpredictable. That's maybe the understatement of the century. While understanding financial history is definitely useful for context, for seeing patterns of human behavior, relying too heavily on past performance or past correlations can make you completely miss those outlier events, those black swans that will ultimately move the needle the most in the future.
History rhymes, but it doesn't repeat exactly.
That's a great way to put it. The global economy, technology, geopolitics, societal values, they're all constantly evolving. Housel points out that structural changes in today's world mean past lessons from history may no longer be applicable in the exact same way, or at least not without significant adaptation and critical thinking. The unexpected isn't just possible, it's inevitable.
And sometimes this means we have to be willing to unlearn things we thought were solid financial facts, which can be really disorienting.
It can be very difficult. The public often internalizes certain lessons during long bull markets, like stocks always go right back up after they go down, or stocks always outperform bonds over any long period. However, as Schiller warns, these perceived facts are often just observations from a specific historical period, and they can be wrong, or at least not universally true forever.
Yeah, tell that to Japanese investors from 1990.
Exactly. Stocks can decline and stay down for many years. They can become significantly overpriced and underperform safer assets like bonds for extended periods. So, adaptability, maintaining intellectual humility, and being ready to question and potentially unlearn old assumptions are absolutely critical skills for long-term investing success. Holding rigidly onto outdated beliefs learned from a different market regime can be just as damaging financially as blindly following the latest crowd mania.
Okay, this next one is really fascinating, especially for younger listeners, maybe those in their 20s or 30s. It's called the end of history illusion. What is that? It sounds like we think we've reached our final form or something.
That's basically it, yes. Long-term planning is difficult because people change over time, and so do their goals and desires. The illusion is this. We're often very aware of how much our personalities, our tastes, our goals, our values have changed and evolved in the past. We can look back 10 years and say, wow, I was a different person then.
Right.
But we consistently underestimate how much we will continue to change and evolve in the future. We tend to project our current self with its current desires and priorities far out into the future, implicitly believing that we've basically arrived at the final, finished version of ourselves. That mistaken belief that personal evolution has largely stopped for us is the end of history illusion.
Huh. So what does this illusion mean for practical financial planning? How on earth do you plan effectively for a future self you don't even really know yet, whose priorities might be totally different from yours today?
It's a huge challenge for long-term planning. To try and minimize regret down the line, House recommends adopting a more moderate mindset today and consciously avoiding extreme financial commitments. That super frugal lifestyle you embrace passionately in your 20s might feel like unnecessary deprivation to your 40-year-old self who values experiences more. Or that huge, expensive house you stretch to buy now might feel like an anchor weighing you down later if your career path changes or you desire more freedom.
So don't lock yourself in too tightly.
Exactly. Your future self might have vastly different priorities, dreams, or values. They might look back and deeply regret the extreme choices you make today. So the advice is to build flexibility into your plans. Give your future self some breathing room, some optionality. Avoid locking yourself into rigid, irreversible paths, whether it's career choices, major purchases, or even investment strategies that might not serve the person you eventually become. Aim for balance and adaptability over extreme commitment. Hashtag 6.5, pessimism is attractive, but optimism wins in the long run.
Okay, last big idea here. Let's talk about the undeniable allure of pessimism. It just sounds so much smarter, so much more sophisticated, doesn't it? Bad news always seems to grab more attention and sound more credible than good news.
It absolutely does. There's a definite bias towards pessimism seeming more intelligent. Housel nails it when he says, pessimism sounds like someone is trying to help you, while optimism sounds like a sales pitch.
Yeah, that's spot on.
Pessimism often feels more plausible, maybe because it acknowledges risks and potential downsides, which seems prudent. And it generally sells better whether it's news headlines warning of the next crash or market commentators focusing on all the things that could go wrong. Think about it. How often do you actually hear two financial experts on TV enthusiastically agreeing that markets look fantastic and everyone should just sit tight for decades and never sell? It's almost always a narrative dominated by caution, complexity, looming risks, and reasons to be worried. That captures attention.
But despite that constant drumbeat of pessimism, the underlying reality, especially for long-term investors, has generally been much more optimistic, hasn't it, for most people, over time?
Precisely. Housel argues strongly that despite its less sophisticated sound, optimism is actually our best bet when it comes to investing because the world tends to get better for most people most of the time. Yes, there are terrible setbacks, recessions, wars, crises, and market crashes along the way, and pessimism correctly identifies those risks. But the long-term historical arc of human progress, driven by innovation, problem-solving, and adaptation, generally trends upward. Economies grow, living standards improve, companies create value over the long haul.
So betting against long-term progress has historically been a losing bet.
Generally, yes. This long-term optimistic view, while maybe less sensational and harder to articulate compellingly than a doom and gloom scenario, is often the perspective most grounded in historical reality for patient long-term investors. It requires a degree of faith, perhaps, in humanity's collective ability to adapt, innovate, and overcome challenges, something which, despite all our flaws, history repeatedly shows we managed to do eventually.
Wow, okay. We have covered so much fascinating ground today. We've gone from those deep-seated psychological triggers that make us want to follow the crowd, the specific financial cliffs that the bandwagon effect can lead us towards, especially early on, all the way to these really practical strategies for building your own compass and safeguarding your financial future. I think the core message that keeps coming through is just how intensely personal this journey is. Your goals, your values, your circumstances, they're absolutely unique to you. What works for the crowd, what everyone else is doing simply might not work for you. And realizing that, embracing that, isn't a sign of failure. It's actually, I think, a profound sign of strength. It's about trusting your own internal compass, like we said.
Absolutely. And maybe if we connect this back to the bigger picture for a second, the societal implications are quite profound. Robert Shiller made that observation that all of our plans for the future hinge on our perceived wealth, and plans can be thrown into disarray if much of that wealth evaporates tomorrow. So, just as a final thought, consider this. What might happen if there was a collective commitment, not to conformity, but to independent, well-informed financial choices? If instead of blindly following herd behavior, more people made decisions based on their own well-researched plans and goals? How might that lead to a more resilient, more stable, maybe even more equitable financial future for everyone? If we each relied more on our own carefully calibrated compass, rather than just chasing every market fad or panicking with the crowd, perhaps the overall stability of our financial systems, our economies, would be far greater. Imagine the cumulative power of millions, even billions, of independent financial compasses all working together, guiding us collectively towards calmer, more sustainable waters.
That's a really powerful thought to end on. It suggests that maybe the most courageous and potentially most impactful act you can take in the world of money today is simply to trust your own judgment, do your homework, and build a financial life that genuinely aligns with your values, not with the pressure to keep up or mimic someone else's online highlight reel. That feels like the true psychology of money at work. So with that, let's try and turn this conversation into a real community. We genuinely want to hear from you, our listeners. What financial bandwagon have you felt tempted to jump on recently? Or maybe tell us about a time you successfully resisted that urge to follow the crowd. What's a financial habit you're currently working on changing, and why is it important to you? Please share your story in the comments or reach out to us. Your journey, your questions, your small victories, they aren't just important, they're incredibly powerful. They enrich this whole community, they help others realize they're not alone in facing these challenges, and they really motivate all of us. Thanks so much for diving deep with us today.